If history is any guide, the probability of several, if not many, of the countries in the West continuing to devolve socially and economically over the next several decades is extremely high. Civilizations are fragile. Rising unemployment caused by automation and AI, economic instability via globalism and debased fiat currencies, unsustainable debt, why not throw in climate change in there as a perhaps, shortages of drinking water in many parts of the world, and never-ending demographically transformative migration will most likely seriously damage, if not implode, much of the West as we know it today. And in the chaos and total lack of social cohesion that we are currently importing, there will inevitably be calls for order and assurances of renewed stability. But there will be a cost. There's always a cost. And the quiet death of much of our freedoms that we are already losing daily will be all but washed away if nothing is done to stop this slide. History has been recorded for thousands of years, and thus surely we must be able to glean something from it, or so is the assertion of Sir John Glubb as delineated upon in his book, The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival. To summarize his thesis, he believes that humans do not learn from history because their study of it is superficial and/or prejudiced. His research led him to the conclusion that 250 years or about 10 generations was the average length of national greatness, and that this average didn't vary for 3,000 years. He also arranged the stages of the rise and fall of great nations as follows. Empires begin when a small group of people violently burst onto the world scene. This pattern, which Glubb sees as being aided by poverty and lack of traditions, has been replicated from Alexander to Muhammad, from the Mongols to the British. This outburst period is marked by the spreading of new customs and habits, think tea time, as well as new ways of thinking. During the outburst period, there is immense displays of courage and great energy. For example, Alexander was able to top the Persian Empire with only 40,000 men. The Arabs took Spain with only 12,000 men. From there, the success of empire leads to an age of commerce. What follows is a replacement of the pursuit of glory and conquest with the adventure of pursuing money. During the Age of Intellect is a time when education is about producing mandarins that are all about maintaining the status quo. It's at this time when the empire, while sapped of its overall strength, still wields enough to keep its vassals in check. It's important to remember that intellectualism in and of itself does not help empire, as people become increasingly lost in elaborate, tautological, and increasingly hypothetical arguments. Because educated debate is not what empire depends upon. Empire depends upon decisive action. And this is the high point of empire, as it's followed by the Age of Decadence, which is marked by defensiveness, pessimism, materialism, frivolity, an influx of foreign peoples, state welfarism of some sort, and a weakening of religion. Glubb identifies the causes of decadence to be the result of too long a period of wealth and power, selfishness, love of money, and the loss of a sense of duty. Now, let's examine how Glubb detailed the Age of Decadence and compare and contrast this with the current paradigm as being enacted in most Western countries today. Also, it's important to understand that these narratives are being spun in societies that both had as well as did not have any history of colonialism. He maintained that material wealth breeds defensive positions, as people have something to lose and are wary of risking too much. It's also at this time that duty is abandoned, selfishness is rife, people forget their past or are made to feel ashamed of it, as we are made currently to feel in the West, and not only forget that predation exists, but welcome predatory peoples in vast numbers through the gates of empire. It's in this phase of decline via decadence that vast numbers of foreigners arrive. Glubb, who spent the better part of his life in the Middle East, was clear that the people that arrive en masse at the tail end of empire are not inferior to those that built it, but they are different from the original people who built the society, and thus constitute a weakness to the nation in 4 ways. First, they are different, culturally different, in nature to the original people. Second, they form their own communities that seek to protect their own interests rather than the nation as a whole. Third, the new peoples arrive at the tail end of empire and arrive at a period of national strength. But when the empire falters, division and at times old grievances are resurrected. Fourth, and most importantly, historically large groups of newcomers are loyal only in times of stability. As a great nation becomes ever more atomized, it becomes ever more fractious, and groups place their own political interests above those of the state. And as domestication via the political process decreases within institutions, so then does political hostility between groups increase and, given time, spills out onto the streets. And does any of this sound familiar to you? Interestingly, and also, the heroes of a declining society are singers, actors, and athletes, not statesmen, academics, or philosophers. The Romans demanded free meals and games, or bread and circuses. Again, think of the cries for an ever-expanded state that provides for its citizens' material needs, as well as people's obsession with sports ball. Outcomes of sports ball matches are elevated to the level of national crisis, when in fact it's grown men that have nothing to do with the local communities they represent, kicking around a ball to the howls of other men who wear their sports heroes' names on their backs, and then these players are paid millions of dollars for essentially playing a game. And sports ball, as well as the players, have been elevated to national obsessions. Also marked examples of civilization decline is the abandonment of sexual morals, and, as much as it hurts our postmodern sensibilities, the increase in the independence of women. Also important to understand is that 7 empires or great nations have disappeared in the last 100 years. The collapse of empire or strong states is something that is basically predetermined from its birth, at least according to Glubb. As monopolies do not last, so too for empire. The 4 major ones being the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the French, and the British, and the 2 shorter than average, the Japanese and Soviet, and the false start of the German. While the Japanese and fledgling German empires were extinguished by war, in contrast, the Soviet Empire is a very unique and historically odd example, which lasted very much shorter than the average imperial lifespan. And the reason it imploded in upon itself was most likely due to the fact that the Soviet Union itself was predicated upon very unnatural institutions that were based in rigid ideology with no inbuilt flexibility. It was an empire most were not happy to reside in or proud to be a part of. When we look upon our Tinder hookup, sports ball obsessed, cowardly submissive, testosterone dropping, low fertility, politically correct, feminine, emotion-driven, decadent societies that are currently being demographically transformed by people arriving from very different cultures, well, at the same time, we're also being told we must constantly apologize for the past and current supposed inequality of these same societies that hundreds of millions globally want to join, Does any of what Glubb outlines with regards to other empires historically and their decline sound at all vaguely familiar? We can meditate on Glubb and then take a look at the European Union in particular. Now, the EU is in the midst of what is truly a particularly bizarre experiment. The EU is attempting to achieve empire via economic unity. But in all fact, it will most likely never be able to do so, as it's made up of cultural groups that have long memories, and they have long memories of being rival states. This makes it particularly difficult for Brussels to hold the group together, as they are not vassals held together via the yoke of empire. At least not yet. And at the very same time, the continent is adding historically hostile cultural groups, and what used to be known as a fifth column. Thus, as increasing economic instability seeps in from the periphery to the core, as well as the social tensions that exists between groups that are currently being forced to share the same space, the fractious nature of the EU and the wider West in general will at some point in the near future no longer be able to be held in check via bread and circuses. The center won't hold, and a political vacuum will be created. What fills this vacuum is what people should be considering. If current conditions are not addressed, and censorship continues to silence the legitimate grievances that people have, and the majority continues to cower in silence, then the end of our period of decadence and decline, well, it looks to be the same as all other great civilizations that have come before. And it would then seem that we are definitely incapable of learning from the past. But there is something to consider. Our society, our global civilization, now has the ability to distribute information and organize in ways that no other people have ever been able to do so in all of human history. The internet and the creation of it is a species-altering technology. We can communicate faster, to more people, and in a web of interconnected threads of epistemology. The time is now. Any civilization that dances with the frivolous will do so at its great peril. The cancer that is spread throughout every organ of our civilization will be terminal if not treated. We need to be on the offensive and take offensive positions and lose our fear of speaking out against the currently insane state and media-enforced paradigm. In the coming troubles that have been brought about by the decadence in our civilization, we will hear inevitable calls for order and assurances of renewed stability. But there's always going to be a price for this. And yes, maybe the experiment in universal suffrage, for example, has run its course, or maybe a reorientation of society is needed, or as yet something unclear or unknown. These things can be worked out in the future. Adjustments will, of course, have to be made along new ways of problem solving. It's either this or the alternative. The alternative will be the continued and inevitable decline of our civilization for refusing to learn from the past, out of a fear of being called illiberal in the face of economic, social, and moral decline. And will, unless we reignite our societies, it will be the epitaph etched on our civilization's tombstone. So that's it. That's the end. Sorry for the number of black pills. However, sometimes it's necessary to hold up a mirror to something nobody wants to see, and of course nobody wants to speak of. But given the fact that we know the course that civilizations have taken previously and now share a kind of hive mind called the internet, there's no reason that we cannot reconstitute ourselves and our civilization along different and stronger lines. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
A mi háborúnk szellemi háború. Most még. Ha eddig vonogattad a vállad azt mondogatva, hogy mit is tehetnék én egyedül a szörnyűségek ellen, akkor jól figyelj. Nagyon egyszerű a feladatod. Kelj fel az ágyról, vedd elő a telefonodat, töltsd le a telegramot, és keresd meg. Jelenleg az ellenállás legminimálisabb feltételésem adottak. Az első lépés a kommunikációs csatornák lefektetése, anélkül csak tehetetlen magányos porszemek vagyunk a hazugság tengerében. Ha pedig alkotó vagy, cikkíró, mozgalmár, ír portáladminja, videós vagy bármi, akkor a feladatod ugyanez. Kelj fel, töltsd le a Telegramot, és indítsd el a csatornád most.